Right. Good afternoon. So what we're going to do now in this panel is it's a continuation of the morphogenetic regulation that we had earlier in the day. Actually, in the afternoon, there will be a presentation by Andrew Dryhurst on the links between MR and AI. We were supposed to also have a presentation by Margot Schultz on morphogenetic regulation and social movements, especially social movements that are resisting to processes of neoliberalization. On behalf of Margot, I would like to apologize. She would not be able to make it. There was a kind of a last minute emergency. So but we were three, and the third one is me, and I'm going to talk about actually the relationship between embeddedness and entanglement between methods of articulation and calibration in political economy, of course, also situated within morphogenetic regulation. So the outcome of all of this is that it means that the good news for Andrew and myself, we will have slightly a bit more time to present our papers, but we will still try to make it within the 20 minutes. So with no further ado, I would like to invite Andrew first to present his paper, and then I will present after that. Okay.
Hello. Right. Let's just make sure these slides are working. Change them. Cool. So very good afternoon, everybody in attendance and online. My name is Andrew Dryhurst, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the Institute for Social Studies in The Hague, evidently working under Karim. I'd also like to say, as Margot's not here today, if you're interested in social movements, neoliberalization, even some critiques of Bourdieu, she really knows what she's doing. So I'd advise you to check her out when the special edition's out in a couple of months. But today, I'm going to be talking to you about generative AI. Now, the academic term for the paper that I wrote for this special issue is an absolute beast. It's 10,000 words, and I couldn't possibly summarize all that in 20 minutes. So I've chosen to just give you an overview of some of the core things of the paper, my logic, just to give you some insights into the work that I'm doing, and perhaps invite you and stoke some kind of curiosity within you to look into the morphogenetic regulation. I'll say MR from now on, because that's a mouthful, over this presentation. So before I go into the focus of the paper, my broad research project is on the political economy of the internet. And really it started because I got very interested in Bitcoin and cryptography post Snowden, and thus interested and quite politically active in stuff relating to data rights, etc. And then it just became very clear about a decade ago that AI was going to happen, so to speak. And following my master's research with Karim, I found the critical realist canon and found it really an interesting and useful framework and philosophical foundation to start looking at the true complexity of AI. So when I'm talking about AI here, I'll talk a little bit about some technical things, because that's important, but also I understand AI as a key paradigm within contemporary capitalism, that systemic level, that can't be disentangled from other processes that occur within society. Okay? So the guiding question really was, why did AI as we know it today develop exactly as it did? And the core philosophical tool from the MR framework that I'm going to talk about is this idea of material and ideational parallelism that draws from the work of Baruch Spinoza, meaning that the material attributes of the world and the ideational are occurring at the same time, have their own...
As your supervisor, I forbid you to quit on the first night. Oh, come back, everyone. He's got a little plastic hanging badge.
Forgive me for those online, that was disturbing. Oh, cool.
This month, ITVX is the place to...
Shall I continue or should I hold it for a second? All right, cool. Did you get the presentation back up? There we go. Thank you very much. Let me get my train of thought back. Meaning that the material and ideational, as they exist as objects of analysis, are occurring and expressing themselves at the same time, but we can only understand the material world as it expresses itself through the ideational. They have their own properties as distinct objects, and they're intertwined and relational, and we need a framework to be able to map this, and this notion of them existing in parallel, distinct and relational, allows us to do that. And within the wider paper, I was looking into the conditioning factors, if we speak morphogenetic language with the CR audience, behind the key loci of power within the political economy of the internet. So what I want to express to you today is one, the value of morphogenetic regulation for approaching the topic, its particular form of contemplative materialism, this parallelism doctrine, and its transimmanent logic. Secondly, I wanted to provide philosophical critiques of influential texts on computation in my own research, because how can I talk about artificial intelligence without reading texts on computation? I'd be a heathen if I didn't do that, right? And thirdly, in the paper, I provided an illustrative morphogenetic cycle to help guide my PhD writing process. So those are the things I'm going to talk about with you today. I've forgotten how to speak English, apparently. For those online, I'm struggling to change the slide. Cool. So in beginning to write the paper, I thought this is going to be very dense. I need some kind of metaphor to guide the reader with understanding the philosophical complexity and argument that's going to come, but also as a heuristic to understand the complex totality of the internet, right? Its physical infrastructure, what it's doing to us as individuals, etc., etc. So this idea of cartography in a thematic level looks at the terrain mapping business practices of the big tech firms. Think your Google, your Facebook, your Amazon. Their entire competitive advantage and oligopolistic situation depends on the mapping that they can do of their relevant markets based on a paradigm of data commodification of all the data trails that exist that they've figured out how to monetize. Facebook, for example, maps social relations. Google maps the web. Uber makes literal maps of the world to train future automated self-driving cars, right? And the network effects that this precipitated. What's a network effect? Just think of the social cost of going off of LinkedIn or losing your connections on Facebook, etc. There's a huge competitive advantage accrued by the data that they hold, right? So to quote another Dryhurst, actually, it's common in the Dryhurst household to talk about this stuff. Google made maps of the web. Facebook makes maps of relationships between people and their interests. Maps are extremely valuable when only the platforms themselves have the tools and expertise necessary to read them fully, exponentially, so that new terrain is created from minute to minute. Perhaps you've read Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism. That's all about predictive behavior futures markets based on your interaction, right? Why is this important? Well, many reasons. These practices, where's this gone? Can we go back a second? Cool. The practices around what happens with our data, how it's treated, how it's collected, they're opaque. They're intellectual property, right? We don't actually know what's going on there. And we're not, big companies will fight tooth and nail to hold on to that, okay? But these systems, this data commodification has huge societal implications. Earlier at the AI workshop that some friends were doing at this conference, you were talking about opaque algorithms involved in sentencing or in job prospects or for economic forecasting, etc., right? It's very important that perhaps we understand what information is going in and the politics of that. Similarly, the power accrual of being able to control important nodes of infrastructure in the modern day. Approximately 4 billion people are operating on the Meta stack, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. That's a lot of responsibility and a lot of power, okay? And finally, to segue into artificial intelligence and why this relates to morphogenesis, okay? The AI that we have today, your ChatGPTs, your Geminis, your diffusion models, etc., are all downstream from the commodification of big data in the 90s that itself could only happen because of particular innovations in the protocol and technical level of how the internet works, right? And just a note that I'll return to at the end of the talk, all media today, every single piece of content that you create online can be a seed or a substrate for an infinite amount of new content. All media should be considered as training data for AI systems, okay? So that's the thematic thing, but theoretically, what's this cartography? Well, we need a way to map the dynamics of something so complex as the internet. Think of the physical infrastructure, the deep sea cables, the power that powers them, the labeling of data for AI systems to learn of, just the massive supply and value chain that exists underneath all of this to make it possible, right? Then think of the fact of what ChatGPT is doing to education, which is obviously a very big deal. These are all part of the same totality. This is why it's important to have a holistic conception and deal with this critical realist problem of emergence, transcendental realism, stratification, etc., because it's all part of the same reality. So when I'm thinking cartography here, map making, how do we map the causal relevance of material and ideational factors in, through, and over time to explain how we got the AI as we know it today? Yep. So this is a key point, is the MR approach adopts a transimmanent logic that takes absence, non-presence, and depresence very seriously. And as I talk today, I'll hopefully explain the relevance of that. So is everything clear thus far? A friendly smile and a nod would be cool. Thank you very much. Okay. So the first literature that I looked into was by a fantastic scholar at Sussex called Beatrice Fazzi, who's both a machine learning engineer and a philosopher, which is a great combination for my field. And prior to engaging with her work, when looking at AI in social sciences, you've also got to have an understanding of how it works, right? You've got the tokens, the basic units that AI break things down into. For pictures, that's a pixel. For words, that's components of the words. You've got the weightings, the strength of connections that neural networks make between different things. The embeddings, the concepts that AI holds about what something is. For example, when you write tree, there is a vector or a probability distribution of vectors as to what could constitute a tree that develops exponentially as you provide more information. And this all occurs within what's called latent space. And latent space is the area or realm where machines make spatial representations of the connections between things. All I'm saying is it's no accident that when you ask Dolly to create a picture of a dog, it generates a picture of a dog. There's something going on there, okay? But also this is the technical aspect of AI, but computation itself, AI is a subset of computation, right? And Beatrice Fazzi talks about computation in terms of formalization as discretization. What does this mean? To formalize something it means providing an algorithmic rule set, a set of code to produce an output, okay? And discretization is the endeavor of representing something in the world. So you're basically telling a computer to adhere to a rule set to represent an aspect of the world. But she draws from Gödel and Turing to show two things. The first is that there's aspects of the world that cannot be condensed down into formal codified rule sets. You can't explain all of reality in a recursive binary way. There's always going to be some aspect of incompleteness to this. That's very important to think of when we deal with AI and computing, because that gives the space to interrogate emergence, right? But Alan Turing in the 30s already foresaw that within computation itself, it's still an indeterminate process. There's an indeterminacy to it. It doesn't always execute in the same way. A basic example is everybody in this room has had an annoying moment with the computer where it hasn't done what you wanted it to do, even though you've done all the right things. That's commonplace within computing. So Fazzi looks at this to really hammer home the contingency and indeterminacy unique to, intrinsic to computation. Excuse me. And she makes this claim that instances of computation, so an entire holistic notion of a computer doing something, contains within it the potential for the computation to actualize itself, to create an indeterminate state to move on to another state. I think this is very, very interesting. And as anyone who's dealt with a large language model knows, you can't predict the exact form of the outcome. So this idea of computational determinacy is a strong one. But I wanted to go into morphogenetic regulation here to kind of critique this claim. Why? If we only understand computation as a siloed milieu of computation that's contingent and consists of horizontal relations, where can we talk about what it is that made that computation possible? Those decisions and agentic moments that went into the particular form of computation being utilized, being developed, what was put in, what was left out. So she's rooted in critical realist terms in actualism, in the event of computation happening. That's cool. That's really, really valuable, but it risks two things: an epistemological conflation of us just dealing with the synchronic contingent events of understanding computers at individual moments in time, where in actuality we could try and look at what wasn't there that made these patterns of indeterminacy in computing arise. Okay, i.e., looking at the conditions behind computational events. As a good child of the internet, I've decided that most things can be described best with a meme. So if we just look at this, I'm sure you remember DeepSeek. This explains my point entirely. OpenAI took a shit ton of data from everywhere online in an opaque way to train ChatGPT. DeepSeek went fishing in exactly what they did. That's dealing with the real, right? The unpresent. You can't tell that from just the computational event. So that's a useful heuristic that is also really good. Memes are the most advanced form of communication, I'm telling you. Anyway, so why morphogenetic regulation? What I've been talking about thus far, and I want to hammer home, is that AI is definitely a tool. Obviously, it's a tool. It would be stupid to say it's not. But AI's existence, the parameters of possibility contained within society by virtue of this thing being when it wasn't before, are greater than just the AI. It's embedded within the accumulation regimes of capitalism. It's embedded within particular practices in politics, in the economy, in technical innovation, et cetera, right? So when I look at computational instance, when I look at an AI doing something, I'm like, okay, but what were the permissive and generative conditions as to why that happened as it did? These mechanisms exist even if they're not present in every individual manifestation, i.e. that's adopting a transcendental logic to looking at the problem of artificial intelligence. To quote the wonderful Dr. Knio, this entails that the environment must be brought back as an object, and thus the complex and non-linear causality that this would entail. AI doesn't happen in a vacuum, but it turns out with a smart use of Spinoza and developing the critical realist canon, you can start to interrogate what must be there in the environment for things to develop as they do with and without society, okay? So what is the environment of AI? I invite you to just think about this. We've got the material conditioning phase. Everyone here should be familiar with Archer, as there's a poster of her right next to me. So I'm assuming you're all familiar with the morphogenetic approach. If we look at the conditioning phase, that which preceded modern AI as we know it today, right? As we deal with it, you've got the protocol and technical layers of the participatory internet that enabled mass data commodification. Many people in this room, or some, I believe, were using computers at a time where you couldn't post, you could just go to static web pages, i.e. the Web 1 era. Evolutions in technical protocols like TCP/IP, HTTP, the hyperlink to move from page A to page B precipitated lots of data trails that could subsequently be monetized and lead to the mass data collection that underlies large language models as we know them today. It's a necessary condition. AI as we know it doesn't happen if Google didn't figure out the PageRank innovation. What were they doing then? quantifying, mapping, and leveraging social relations to be able to give you better advertisements and ostensibly cheaper prices on goods. But that initial innovation led to them becoming one of the biggest companies in the world. To quote myself in a paper I did with Zach Sloman and Yazid Zahda a couple of years ago, the underlying architecture of these flows of abundant information facilitated their monetization and a concentration of power arising from the data's evolution into both a capital good and an organizing architecture by virtue of the extensive modeling that it made possible. All right? Other material things to think about pre-AI, mass data centers that were built, GPU technology, that's graphic processors that were used to make games, to make graphics better in games, but people figured out you could run parallel computing on those and crunch numbers a lot better to lead to much more efficient computing. So lots of AI systems now run on GPUs. This all happened before ChatGPT. This happened before Facebook, right? And device availability. In the 90s, the personal computer became a household item. Quite important. At the same time, there's also ideational factors to consider. If you think of the early internet, perhaps you're familiar with the cypherpunks, or maybe not. These are people that were very, I don't know, digital, anarchistic, libertarian oriented, who wanted to ensure privacy and non-government intervention as to what you could and couldn't do online. It was advocating for a very particular kind of decentralization. Why is this important? Because this was decentralization from government overreach, but that didn't factor in corporate overreach, right? It's a particular ethos of that time that is still seen in the Bitcoin community, in the Ethereum community, etc. A particular kind of decentralization that became ingrained in the public imaginary as to what the internet could and should be. This idea that information wants to be free is another one. This idea that we shouldn't curtail the length to which we can spread information. Everybody should have a voice. Well, that is a sentiment, and people do believe that. Look at the backlash in the UK right now to what's perceived as government censorship. So this is a persistent ideational factor. This idea by mathematician Clive Humby of data being a new oil, the new oil. This legitimized these practices that were set in motion, or this sentiment. Think of the number of people that across industries that we'll talk about, data for economic modeling, data for government forecasting, data for you name it, marketing across all kinds of industries and all cross sections of society. An ideational factor that we need to consider pre-AI. Very important one, 20th century models of authorship. The artist as the individual, intellectual property is understood by the artist as the sole creator of a work. How does that work in an era where AI can generate infinite content on derivatives of original works? That has to be rethought, but that's a contradiction of an ideational lineage that is currently led to a crisis today. And finally, attitudes towards regulation. I will buy a drink to whoever tells me whose motto this was. Move fast and break things. Come on, people. Move fast and break things. What big tech company? Well, owner gets a drink. If someone wrote it online, sorry, I'll send you something in the mail. Yeah, that used to be Facebook's mantra. You can see why I've put that there, right? Move fast and break things. This idea of regulation being bad. That is intrinsic in like the dev developer mindset of people that are building AI systems. But this is all the conditioning, but how agents respond to these imperatives materially and culturally that were inscribed is where we're at now. AI is quite new. All of this stuff I've talked about has happened in the last 30 or so years. And I don't think we're at an elaboration stage yet. We're still figuring this out. Of course we are. The GDPR is still being refined. The EU AI Act is still being refined, et cetera, et cetera. And to talk about what's so difficult, look what happened when the US banned TikTok. It lasted for like 2 weeks. Or when Australia tried to ban Facebook. You're using old school logics in this sense to try and ban something that is emerging and being shaped in real time by new imperatives. So What I'm doing in the interaction is looking at the nature and emergent interactions during this period now. Look what I just said. I just talked to you about network effects, physical infrastructure, data commodification. The new motto of Meta, which used to be move fast and break things, is now move fast with stable infrastructure. Basically, we've got all the infrastructure now. We can keep moving fast. Who's going to challenge us? And that's overtly their motto at the moment. Excuse me. So I also do appreciate to everyone in the room and online, I am steamrolling through this. There's a lot of information, but I hope that you're somewhat following my logic here. During this interaction phase, there's two big things that I think really exemplify this moment of crisis of interaction. If we think of the problem of data poisoning, which refers to the injection of bad information into AI training sets to influence the outcome, which can be done at scale and very cheaply. This is a tremendous problem that can be fixed or addressed potentially with technical things, but those technical fixes may upend or come to challenge all of these cultural norms as to what people believe the governments can and can't do online. Okay? Similarly, this idea of copyright, who owns the IP over stuff that happens online, there's big debates. Should there be universal opt-outs for people to remove their information from data sets in an automated way? Should they be paid for it? Should big companies pay licenses to access this data? Should the companies seek permission on individual bases? These are all ideas that are being floated within policy circles right now. And the present moment to use language from the MR is one of self-explication, where there's ideas permeating in the wider AI milieu, where agents are maneuvering to still figure out how best to respond to all these crises that AI's emergence has precipitated. Kareem, I've got like 2 more minutes. Another one that further complicates this is that big tech uses open source software to reify their competitive advantage. And think of the kind of contradiction here. So they'll wall off, they won't show you how the things work, how they get their data, etc., but will gladly use tools that are developed and used for free online to reify their competitive advantage. To quote Mark Zuckerberg from a fantastic paper by Vidar et al., Vidar et al., you know, it's more people. PyTorch, which is Facebook's machine learning library, has generally become the standard of the industry. It's generally been very valuable for us, Facebook, because it's integrated with our technology stack, all the things they make. When there are opportunities to make integrations with products, it's much easier to make sure that developers and other folks are compatible with the things that we need in the way that our systems work. Okay? So what that really is saying is that the conditions for data to have been collected and created such a huge competitive advantage, that era is done. We have a situation where large monolithic corporate entities have a tremendous amount of information and streams, channels of information to map us, our behaviors, what we do, to be able to reify this advantage. And every time you use an AI system, it learns more about you, and the you in this sense can be everybody. It can be at the individual and the aggregated scale. Okay? So to conclude, what was the point of everything I just said, if you did follow? Firstly, that artificial intelligence training and the conflicts that arise out of it are deeply shaped by the imperatives of the early internet, the conditioning phase. You can't talk about AI properly now and understand the contestations going on with AI without understanding the material and ideational factors that persist from that time. The interaction phase, where we are now, represents a societal reckoning with the consequences of this and the prevailing cultural norms regarding information flow, deregulation, and innovation online. The transimmanent logic of morphogenic regulation is key for understanding the perseverance and persistence of these underlying conditions. What's this transimmanent logic that I've mentioned a few times? I don't remember if I defined it. You're imminently embroiled within a morphogenetic cycle, but the nature of it, its perseverance, its properties, only come to reveal themselves to you over time through transcendental contemplation and reflection, i.e. transimmanence. And this is also why it's really useful for mapping the contours of the contested AI modernity. So I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, Andrew. Really just on time. Can we please play the next slides? Okay. So so the title of my talk is actually kind of a recent paper that I've published in Globalization. It's a leading journal in IPE, a critical one of those few that are left in that sense. I would like to actually kind of make a kind of a quick summary of it. Normally, I start by putting a structure of the talk, but I thought for a better presentation today, I will take you through the story one step after the other. So, in around the 2010s, the literature on new materialism started to gain salient currency. I don't know if you're like a bit familiar with it. This is the literature. I mean, if you go a bit beyond the surface, it might sound like a historical materialist literature, but it's not. It's actually very much Deleuzian in its philosophical tendency. They focus very much on the ontology of uniqueness and the relational ontology in that sense. But the concept of entanglement was key in relation to this philosophy. They started actually talking a lot about how the material converses, feels, interacts. Yes, yes, yeah. I didn't want to make grimace about that, but yes, they talk about the material in that sense, and in the sense that because it feels and it converses, it is actually entangled with the subject, with the object, and with artifacts. Now, on the left here, we have Karen Barad, a very famous proponent of an approach like that. In this particular context, she was talking about her famous approach about interaction and what she actually refers to as agentic realism. So basically, as you can see here from that particular quote from Barad, where just to make the link of how she was using entanglement in that sense, or now given my presentation, this Deleuzian type of entanglement, she was obviously contesting ontologies that separate things. So if you separate things, you're going to celebrate a kind of a logic of interactions. But since this is coming from a Deleuzian approach, she was actually more pioneering this kind of logic of interaction, or as I said, agential realism, to use her language, because for her it is all about the relationality and actually how this relation, if you want, is entangled, meaning how it is actually interwoven between those entities. So in that sense, there is no point in actually talking about interaction. The action comes from within a particular unity within that particular sense. This is how this literature, which if you're following IP and IR now, is very much a la mode in that sense, but I would like to insist on its Deleuzian emphasis and on how they have been using entanglement in that sense. The other thing that I did in the paper, however, is to remind everyone, no, I want to go this way. I don't know where. Okay, I wanted to remind everyone that the concept of this Deleuzian capture of entanglement is actually nothing new, but not only nothing new, that actually it existed as well prior to the embeddedness debates. And in that sense, scholars need to start putting things into perspective. I would like to first remind you here, for the person on the left, Karl Polanyi, right? The sociologist in that sense that coined the term embeddedness. For those of you who might know about the legacy of Polanyi, this is a kind of a scholar who reminded us about that the economic in and of itself does not have properties, yet, and especially in relation to his analysis of crisis, it has to be, I mean, he coined the word embeddedness, but to use another word, the economic needs to be enmeshed with the cultural, with the legal, with other kind of dimensions in that sense. And one of the legacies of Polanyi, especially in relation to his first book, The Great Transformations, is that he left us with this concept of the pendulum, if you want, between embeddedness and disembeddedness. So to cut a long story short, a lot of social scientists define neoliberalism of our days as a kind of an act of disembeddedness, right? So to cut a long story short, how the economic is being detached, right, from the cultural, from the social, and so on and so forth. So in so many ways, our social life is very much like moving, swinging, if you want, between instances of embeddedness, disembeddedness, if we followed that classical reading. The reason why I'm putting the pictures of the other people is just to show you that actually this classic work by Polanyi generated a lot of intense debate in political economy. And if you are a bit patient with me, you will see the link with entanglement. So for example, the one after Polanyi here, this is Fred Bloch. Fred Bloch was kind of famous in the literature. He's a sociologist, economic sociologist, because he explained to us very well that actually if you are a truly Polanyian, you should no longer entertain the concept of disembeddedness. So to cut a long story short, he started actually celebrating the concept of always embedded. So the economic can never be detached at all, rather than actually talk about those different instances. So in a way that we should always look at the, if you want, the enmeshment, the total enmeshment that all of these relations create. The one after is Professor Mark Harvey. Harvey actually had a particular problem with the always embedded of Fred Bloch that I was telling you about. Why? Because actually then he said, if actually it is always embedded, then we have lost all sorts of analysis, all sorts of any particular attribute in relation to what the economic actually means. We have lost the specificity of the economic. So instead of embeddedness, which he felt like it is a kind of a non, how shall I say, representative debate in that sense, he suggested into how we can trace the institutionalization of that economic in different historical and context in that particular vein. So rather than embeddedness in that sense, perhaps Harvey is a more of an advocate in relation to the scalar institutionalization of the economic and how the economic is speaking to non-economic factors. Which would lead us towards the one on the right, the famous professor in sociology, Michel Calon. And Calon introduced the concept of entanglement as a kind of a problem that deals within this. Calon, like the other two scholars, find that the embeddedness might be a bit problematic. Calon actually used embeddedness in a very interchangeable way with entanglement, but the problem is that Calon insisted that every entanglement would then lead towards a disentanglement, and then every disentanglement would lead toward entanglement. Entanglement in this sense, and not from the Deleuzian point of view, it actually means the whole process of how you are going to attach and detach value as you are moving through economic processes. Calon was a sociologist, but he did a lot of case studies in relation to how we can explain market exchanges, obviously against rational choice theory and neoclassical economics. So this process of attaching and detaching value was very important for him. So the necessity to attach value towards something would necessarily lead towards at some point that you are actually moving to detach those particular values, which means that it becomes possible to differentiate between different conditions, different economic and non-economic conditions. And in so doing, he found that the concept of entanglement and disentanglement is more capturing than the whole concept of embeddedness. Why I'm telling you all of this story? Because basically the puzzle at the end becomes one like this. Oh, this is not helping me. I don't know why it's not moving. Can I? Yeah, I tried all directions now. Oh, sorry. Yeah, because the first element is that actually the dominance of entanglement, this Deleuzian dominance, needs to be put in practice or in perspective in that sense. And there's as well a rich kind of literature of entanglement within the embeddedness debate. But that actually highlights for you here the puzzle of what analytically of what I'm talking about. Uh, this circle is not the one I'm talking about. This is only from the slide. I'm talking about embeddedness here, which is very much an enmeshment. As you can see, some would insist that some lines within it are very important, but others would actually insist on its totality, as opposed to the kind of the process of, you know, like they may have certain kind of, let's say, some kind of an existence, but the whole point is about how they can come together and depart from each other, and the process that is tying all of that. That is what the puzzle is all about, and that's what I wanted to dig deeper beyond the propaganda of entanglement within this Deleuzian world. So from there, I wanted to dig, as I was saying, a bit deeper. What is the analytical commonality that those two literatures that they have in political economy literatures? The first 2 points that you can see are quite obvious. The first one is that they are both anti-essentialist, right? They're basically trying to remind us, well, very important still in our days, that the economic, let's say if it's the most important, it is not, but soi-disant, that the economic in itself does not have property. So they were there that actually it has to be taken in totality with the other kind of dimensions in that sense. So it is definitely anti-essentialist in that sense. And of course, both of them are analyzing the relationship between the economic and the non-economic. Nonetheless, I took a step a bit more than this to try to show you that what they really have in common is the method of articulation. Anyone is familiar with the method of articulation? No? It goes all the way back to Hegel, and Karl Marx talked about it all the time. Actually, these days, we talk about it all the time. I always try to remind my students, they talk about methods, marks of abstraction. It's like, halt, Hegel. Actually, Marx's approach is Hegelian in that sense. You have to go back to the master. You have to go back to how Hegel actually talked about the method of from the abstract to the concrete. This is what we're talking about here with the method of articulation. So how do we talk about it in few words? First, it is this particular approach of how, in order to understand reality, reality doesn't come to us straightforward, right? We use processes of thought. We use, to start with Hegel first, we use particular concepts in order to understand it. Those concepts, however, are limited, right? They are, in so many ways, they are also not complete at all. So what we try to do is we try to refine them, we try to alter them, we try to also go beyond certain dimensions of the particular kind of thought process and experiences that we have highlighted there. So for example, to cut a long story short, you could not only amplify whatever kind of observation or logic or concept you have introduced, you can amplify it in terms of layering. You could also add some, how shall I say, I said layering, but you could also do some kind of, some kind of combinational kind of an aspects between them. So you're going between different kind of dimensions in order to explain a totality of thing. The movement from abstract to thought, I have to remind you, it is thought, abstract to concrete. Concrete is concrete in thought. And that is also true for Marx. And concrete in thought, Karen, you talked about it earlier as well today. Concrete in thought is basically the totality of the whole determinations in that sense that were accrued from all of these particular thought. So the end point that what they're trying to tell us is that those initial thought determinations that we may have in relation to different planes of abstraction in and of themselves do not have properties. What we need to account for, that's why it's called concrete in thought, is that type of relation that hold all of them together in that sense. So it is the totality of all of those determination that brings all of this into fruition. This would lead towards the ultimate explanation in that sense from this movement from the abstract to the concrete in thought is that it is an approach that allows you to unravel, if you want, unity in difference. So in other words, the initial thought process, the movement for you to put things on a different planes of existence would eventually lead towards a celebration of ontology of difference, but it's trying to remind you as well that there is a kind of a relata, a relation that holds all of this together, and then there is a kind of a unity in difference behind all of this. What is the other implication of that particular explanation? It is totally immanent. So the whole point behind this particular kind of explanation is that this relation, what they're trying to tell us, the ideational or the material do not have a logic beyond themselves. So do not think about other dimensions or other type of layers of reality. Actually, there is this particular kind of an immanent relation that actually ties all of these initial determinations behind this. So the whole language about unity in difference is an immanent logic. Now, I think the immanent logic can give us a lot of advantages, but I actually find it a bit problematic. And this is where I was juxtaposing it with the logic of calibration, which is actually not only just the opposite transcendental, but actually more transimmanent because it is rooted within the first, the immanent causality morphogenetic approach, which is also implemented within the morphogenetic regulation approach that we have been talking about all along today. So a bit of some quick introductions here. The MR, which is also based on the ICMA, the immanent causality morphogenetic approach, it is based on the morphogenetic approach of Margaret Archer, but it problematizes her analytical dualism. One of the points that I was always trying to argue that by problematize, I don't mean that the analytical dualism had its own benefits, but it also has certain limitations that I talked about them in different papers. But actually, the next step to keep up with this morphogenizing way to talk about, I suggested that we can use the notion of immanent causality from Spinoza. Immanent here does not mean immanent etymologically. Immanent here has to be understood in philosophical terms. So in other words, immanent causality refers to how a substantive cause is expressed, or if you want, inscribed in its immanent parts or in its immanent effects. That's what it means. So it's actually not a literal immanence, it's a philosophical immanence. Philosophical immanence brings in as well transcendental as well. They cannot be either or, they are together. Hence, the focus of the two panels on transimmanence logic that lies behind MR. So to cut a long story short, I would like to introduce the following kind of aspects. The first thing, there's like, it might be important to highlight the importance of essence. Essence are the ways things are, where if you want like the qualities that they have, the characteristic that they have, some of the mechanisms that speak or reveal to you what they are in that sense. The Spinozian literature is a bit more specific when it comes to essences. Essences are there called as attributes, because attributes are, by the way, those essences that are conceived by an intellect through themselves. So to cut a long story short, here a very famous example of attributes that Spinoza left us with is the mere distinction between the material and the ideational. It is conceived by the intellect through these particular qualities in that sense. I'm not saying these are the only ones, but these are the ones that are quite famous in that sense. Modes, the other shorthand for modes is modes of substance. Modes are basically in philosophy language are properties, and properties, they can be, you know, examples of these could be dispositional capacities or dispositional capabilities, and there are differences in relation to that. This is where I think critical realism is very helpful, because it adds different analytical strength about these. But modes are basically the forms of these particular essences. Um, when you bring together essences and modes within this kind of line of thinking, these speak to permissive conditions. Now, this is very important. Why permissive? Because by virtue of the definitions that we were talking about, they actually reveal to you the modes is everything is predicated on something that is prior to that, while attributes is about how it is conceived by the intellect themselves, right? So they are permissive conditions because they can be, in that sense, if you want, conceived and articulated either in a momentarily present way or in a non-present way. So that's one form of absence. Absence here as unpresence, non-presence. So either they are revealed to you like in the presence defined as a momentary thing, or actually a non in that sense. All of this is very much different from the other important concept that a lot of social scientists have a lot of um, don't have a lot of background about this, which is the concept of substance. Substance, especially not only for Spinoza, but also in contemporary philosophy. Let me start with the negatives. It is not about the thing like the material stuff. That is not what the philosopher. So always differentiate between what it means in English or whatever language you're reading and what it means in philosophy. It also does not necessarily have to relate to an absolute that you cannot deal with at all. I mean, before the 17th century, that was true. What it actually talks about is that substance is what allows you, it is what the grounds all of those essences that I'm talking about. So if I have to put it in simpler ways, if essence, attributes, and modes are permissive conditions, when we're referring to substance, we're referring to the powers that ground those essences. In social sciences, they conflate essences with substances, but actually substance are the powers behind essences in that sense. If essences are actually permissive conditions and they are either momentarily present or non-present, substances are deep present, They are extrinsic. It doesn't mean they don't exist. They mean they are outside this whole phenomena. Because if they are actually having any particular, if they ground the essences, they cannot be present in their relations, in their properties, and in the events that they create. If you actually deny that, then you will have a logical fallacy in that sense. So, as you can see now, we have essences on one side, which are, they could be presentist or non-presentist, and substances that are generative powers that are essentially depresentist in that sense. How do they meet? And this is where the concept of caliber comes in. Caliber is basically, to cut a long story short, is the unity. It is taken from old Arabic philosophy, caliber from qalib. Qalib means it's a kind of a conditioning entity that brings all of these differences together. It is, to cut a long story short and to use the contemporary philosophical language, it's the unity that accounts for the differences that you are encountering in the whole way. So to cut a long story short, substances and with their causality are expressed in calibers, which are the entonnoir and the conditioning kind of a part that actually ties all the different types of essences that I'm talking about in that sense. This is what we mean here by the logic of calibration. Calibration is basically a particular method of thinking that takes caliber substance seriously. And you might stop me here to tell me, but why then you talked about Polanyi? Because Polanyi's approach was known as the substantivist school in IPE. I wanted to write this article, and I'm proud that I wrote it, to bring back Polanyi home. To do substantive, you need to take the philosophy of substance very seriously in that sense. And as you can see here, it is also demarked as well within the morphogenetic cycle. So that's what calibration actually means, and that's what transimmanence that is operationalized by calibration also deploy. What's the value added of this approach? Here, it allows us to talk about essence, but not essentialism. I hope now that becomes clear. The second one, it is not about unity in difference, as most of those analyses actually try to do. It's actually unity for difference and unity over difference. And unity over difference allows you to start dealing with the problematic of perseverance, or if you have to put it also in other terms, systemic persistence over time, and not only in time. And as you can see, the third one is what I would call, in a very simple language, bring Karl home, bring Karl Polanyi home. It is not the movement from abstract to concrete. It's actually the other way around. We start by looking at the role of history, how certain, let's say, social relations has been historically institutionalized, and we start actually the process of contemplating in relation to finding out the abstracts that were always there in relation to their formation in that particular sense. So to put it in other words, it is through Andrew mentioned it earlier, it becomes, it allows us to move beyond the dogma of certain schools of thought where the material is already assumed. In this approach, the material is not assumed at all. It is through the ideational that we will be able to actually arrive to the material. That is key to a transimmanent logic and to the calibration method in that sense. I want to leave you with an example. In the article, actually, I provided two examples from IPE, contemporary IPE. I won't have the time to talk about the second one. The second one is on a literature very recent called ascetization. So some scholars are trying to introduce a concept of asset, so assetization, as against the Marxists who focus a lot on accumulation of capital and all of that, so commodification of capital in that sense. I don't have the time to go through that literature because there's a lot of jargon, but I would like to give you a quick example from the other literature here, the variegated approach. Variegated approach to study neoliberalization. We can benefit today from more than 4 decades, not 40, 4 decades of neoliberalization existence, right? If you notice, we move from 1970s to today. At least this literature allows us to distinguish today between 4 different types of spatio-temporal scales. Meaning, if you notice, between the 70s and 80s, we had actually kind of a disarticulated, these are their words, uneven neoliberalization. Neoliberalization was still a nascent thing. It had different scales across different geographies and time. Between the 90s and 2000s, actually we moved from a disarticulated to an articulated, deepened form of neoliberalization. Neoliberal norms, practices, ideas became uniform across the globe in that sense, right? Then if you look at the plateau on top, it's actually, this is after the recent financial crisis. I'm talking 2007, 2008. It's articulated, but to their words, it halted. So neoliberalization is still alive and kicking, but it is no longer deepening as we witnessed it in the 90s and 2000s. And the last one is debatable. Some people are happy to declare that neoliberalization is dead. I don't share that view. I think it's quite naive. But you may want to argue that there is some kind of retreat of neoliberalization, perhaps. Anyway, this is not the point that I want to defend here. These are four important spatio-temporal scales that those authors, those geographers actually introduced. But are you aware what the concept of variegated means? Obviously, it's not variation. Variegated. Variegated means systemic production of all of these geo-institutional differentiation that I'm telling you about the same process, right? So they define this variegation, again, I repeat, systemic production of those geo-institutional differentiation as the intensification of the processes of commodification and marketization. So what cuts across all of these different scales of neoliberalization in the last 40 years must have been systemically produced by the, if you want, the prioritization of that particular logic. Now, to cut a long story short, this is a very good example about unity in difference, example of an immanent analysis, and this say from the point of view of calibration, this is a point that does not deal with causality and temporality and time in a very high level. Why? Because the intensification of marketization and commodification, they are within their immanent parts. They are not, they are at some point today, they are presentist. They were unpresent at a particular point, but they are not actually outside that phenomenon. They do not account for the deep kind of causation. That is the argument that calibration is trying to say. If you're really interested in the systemic logic that explains the perseverance behind this phenomena, the ultimate immanent cause here, immanent in a philosophical way, needs to be actually outside. It has to be deep present, has to be extrinsic, and then inscribed in its form, not embedded in its form, as they're trying to say here. In the morphogenetic regulation and building on the French regulation school, the argument here would be saying actually what is behind neoliberalization is the primacy of extensive regimes of accumulation. And I will leave you with this. Extensive regimes of accumulation is outside because it explains not only the motives, but also the logics behind these commodification and marketization. Commodification and marketization in this particular explanation become the expressiveness of that cause. Meaning, when you go to the shop, you may have witnessed some people who have feelings about, you may have witnessed commodification processes in front of you, marketization as well. You went into certain periods in your life into shops where we weren't even, we didn't even know about these because we didn't research them that deeper in a depth way as well. But the only thing that I want to leave you with is that we do not internalize at any point in time, except that we are doing research about it, that we go to a shop to buy something and we internalize that this is actually the result of an extensive regime of accumulation, and how an extensive regime of accumulation is an always constant kind of, if you want, dialectics with an intensive regime of accumulation, and so on and so forth. These are the, if you want, the premise and the promise of the method of calibration. It's an invitation to resist conflating the cause with the expression of the cause. And in that sense, also, it allows us to go beyond just pure immanent way of analysis and invite us to go a bit into a trans-immanent way of analysis at the same time. And I will stop here. If you have any other questions, of course, please feel free. And yeah, I will stop here. Thanks. The chair of this session, so I'll change my hat now. Okay, open for questions. Okay, Karen and sorry. Do they use it?
Sorry, but for the uninitiated, can you give me an example or a concrete some kind of help me with a concrete understanding of what an extensive regime of accumulation is.
An extensive regime of accumulation speaks to certain kind of formulation of capital that is more interested in, they don't want to radicalize the productivity between technological innovation and production. They want to keep it as it is. They try to get their profit more from squeezing the labor component. And actually, when they have a more of an interest in securing a certain kind of monopoly in a certain market, not to deepen their capital provision, because once then they face a strong competition, they because of that squeezing element that I'm telling you about, they have the capability to move from one place to another. So they are very much, how shall I say? That's why we call them extensive. They're not deepening capital properties or even labor properties in that sense. On the contrary, they have an intrinsic logic to actually not to diversify, but to move across geography and time in that sense.
Sounds very Marxist to me.
No, we need to liberate all of this from Marx. No, this is non-Marx. Marx uses these. These are definitions. I would even say before Marx.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean Marx might agree with this. Not might. Will definitely agree with this definition. But I insist.
Okay. Yeah.
Take Marx out of that. No.
So can you
Don't give him credit for this.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you tell me who is an author who uses or who has
This terminology,
yeah the extensive
French
regime?
regulations.
French regulation.
I suggest you read the work of Robert Boyer. I suggest here article because he works on this a bit more precisely. There's a guy called Juillard from that school, and yeah, he actually he built this definition really well. If you're interested in the genealogy and the history of this, are you familiar with the Arrighi? Giovanni Arrighi introduced this terminology in its original set, and of course, different historical material schools then try to color it in different ways. That's why I'm trying to tell you: be sensitive. Like some Marxists use it, but they are definitely not the inventor of that. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I don't know your name. Can you? The questions are for both of us, huh?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting speech. I'm interested about the issue of social time, and I would like to ask you whether would you agree with the idea that social relations have social time as an emergent property? I'm thinking here the concept of Archer's situational logics. And I would like to ask you whether you agree that, for example, the protection, as Archer has named one of the social situational logics, present a kind of social time.
Absolutely, yes. But that's why the MR is based on MR, the application of the immanent causality morphogenetic approach into the regulation. So we use all of those Archerian logics, situation logics, and all of that, but in a different twist. The answer is yes, but there is a difference with Archer. I mean, the yes should be clear, but the difference is that okay, maybe I should, there's a concept here. The Archerian approach to time here, the social time, is what we call perdurantist, meaning it transfactually exists, but it only exists as a whole. And the whole here is the morphogenetic cycle. I partly accept that, but actually part of that model is that we go into the time slices of every particular portion of the model as well, which Archer does not. And I'll give you an example. T2, T3, if you read the model really well, does not have the social time in it in that sense. Do you see what I mean? It is in the conditioning and in the elaboration, because actually in the elaboration via the role of reflexivity.
Because I think that Archer talks about the situational logics. Mm-hmm. Social time differs across the different social logics.
Yes.
In any case, I would like to confirm whether social time is an emergent property of a thing, of an entity, which we call relation.
Exactly, but that's what I'm trying to say. Why? Because that time that exists in those particular, let's say, trenches is real. It has emergence. It has emergence powers, and it's stratified. But I am saying there is more than that as well when you go into time. This is where the caliber and substance comes in. But actually, how would you arrive to that substance? It is through those time. Uh, in the literature, there's one article I distinguish between perdurance and exdurance. Exdurance is basically they will tell you objects don't persist, they just transform. So actually, the logic here is that okay, let's start with this agnostic approach first. They might just transform, but actually, when you start digging into this notion of over time, you are able to highlight that whole. The Archerian logic in its original version is only perdurantist. I hope I answered your question. What about AI?
Thank you. These presentations, without including your, is very interesting for me, but these ideas are very fresh and I should have time to thinking about, especially this terminology. But I think this presentation touch to the very important point to the critical realism. And I have thought from some time, sometimes, what after Bhaskar and Archer? Because idea to be alive should develop. And how to have with respect to the fundament of classics of critical realism to do next steps in ontology, in epistemology, but not only for them for themselves, but to open new perspective for economy, sociology, and so on. So I feel in this moment, because I have to have time to thinking deeply about it, but I feel that it is very interesting new perspective for critical realism to rest with our sources in Bhaskar and Archer fundaments, assumptions, and to develop the idea. So I believe critical realist will be young again. Thanks.
Thank you for your comment. I will give the floor to Andrew to respond perhaps to this from an AI, but a very quick reply is like 2 points that come to my mind via your intervention. First, I really like what you said, Karen, earlier about critical realists. I think today need to have more and more debates with philosophy of social science, especially with those that we don't agree with. It's essential. Otherwise, there won't be the blood would not rejuvenate itself in that sense. So this is one, how it can go also beyond that. But two, I would like to also highlight something that I've said last year in Warwick in the symposium for Maggie, in the sense that the way that I see this work, the work on the linking into Spinoza, is actually a further deepening of the morphogenetic tradition that she's trying to do. I'm a proud Archerian, but it's actually part of how the school must develop is also, so for example, that's why I'm like, I have a problem with analytical dualism now. I didn't have a problem with it 10 years ago, but actually I'm still Archerian and I'm actually very proud Archerian, but the word Archerian needs to be now also defined, I would say, in new terms, because for example, here I'm proposing a new way. Other people will also propose other ways. This is how those traditions can be kept alive, I would say. And I think that speaks to your observation. And I hope you see why I also was talking about further debates with other schools of thought, also with people who work with philosophy of social science, would only be beneficial for the rejuvenation of the school in that sense. Absolutely. So I agree. Andrew, do you like to reply to this? And I.
Small question, Kareem. I mean, firstly, I mean, evidently, as evidenced by the fact I've chosen to dedicate years of my life to work with Kareem, I agree with you that this is both an exciting and necessary just development to rejuvenate the school of thought. We're all here because we're attracted to the maxims of the critical realist canon. Stratification, transcendental realism, etc. They all made a lot of sense as a critical lens for inquiry. And with me, as I hope I showed you with my bazooka of a presentation earlier, that, for example, when dealing with AI, analytical dualism at the level of structure agency wouldn't suffice to properly interrogate the complexity of what's going on, both at a technical computing level, but also culturally, if we think of the multifaceted impacts of digital modernity, AI devices, what they're doing to socialization, our mental health, the economy, it's kind of infinite. And within this MR, ICMA, etc., development of the school, I see it as an homage to Archer and Bhaskar, whilst also developing upon the valuable assets of their core tenets, but being able to put more rigor and complexity in spaces where they perhaps were somewhat limited. For example, the interaction phase, when we were just talking about the problem of social time earlier, or Karim was just explaining. So I'm really glad that you share that curiosity or excitement that I also feel for it.
Thank you so much indeed. I find both presentations absolutely beautiful. I have a clarification question about the substance that you talked about, which is an item in your chart, which is supposed to be depresent. And if I understood you correctly, it was also the cause that you identified that, that caused something that's got some causal power. And perhaps in that example, in the final chart that you had about the neoliberalism and so on, or that cycle, whatever, that substance is perhaps the accumulation of acid, or is accumulation of whatever was accumulation of something. I forgot. Yeah, what?
And
No, there was accumulation
extensive regime of accumulation.
Yeah, extensive regime of accumulation. I don't know whether that is that substance that you were talking about. And in any case, I wonder if you could perhaps elaborate a little bit whether and why you use the term trans-immanent, basically transcendental immanent, because there is quite a bit of similarity also to the meta philosophy. Pascal used these concepts, where it's the most immanent is also the most transcendent and vice versa. So I wonder if you could perhaps explain a little bit of the mechanics of how it is immanent and, trans-immanent.
Yeah, very quickly, because I would say in the past, people refer to substance first as a thing, even like a material object. Actually, we were in certain postdoctoral seminars, and some of our colleagues understood substance as a thing, and it was a bit surprising. So, yeah, don't be surprised that even that belief is still persevering. But the literature went beyond that. So it is in another word for it, if you want a technical one, is a kind. Sometimes they refer to it as it's a kind, right? Then there was a kind of approach because of the sophistication of Aristotle as well and the different interpretations on Aristotle. There was a kind of a work that tried to link then that thing, to properties. So if you recall, Aristotle, actually the primary substance is again the present and all of that in his famous categories. But then when he starts talking about secondary, tertiary, and all of that, it becomes like if you want, the space between substance and properties started to become maybe not only conflated, but like merging. Okay, so then after the 18th century, there has been a kind of a movement where basically the substance now is no longer used in A or B, even though they still exist today. That actually the argument, so that's what I'm trying to highlight here, is that if you have essences and properties are particular forms of those essences, actually substance, or the substratum, if you are more technical, is what underlies it. So in that sense, we moved away from kind, or kind of kind, or relations of kind, or kind of kind, towards actually an incorporation of the two in a particular order. Hence transimmanence. You cannot actually then make an argument only based on immanence, but you can, if you're following that line of analysis, but also talking about a line of analysis that would argue, yes, substance, I may ontologically make that particular argument, but how do you touch it? How do you experience it? You would also have an epistemological problem that is based on all of that as well. Substance, so transcendental argument pure is also problematic. So that is why actually the literature moved into this transimmanence, and actually they are related. They are so. To cut a long, I hope you see what I'm trying to say, but to cut a long story short, when those definitions, the earlier definitions that I shared with you were popular, you had crude distinctions between the transcendental and the immanent. But that is not the case today, even though that some people try to differentiate them. That is not the case. There are different degrees of whether you pay more attention on the transcendental issue or the immanent. That is true. But actually, you are always theorizing them in relation to each other. The possibility to separate is not on the table. And I try to further give you examples. Why? Because the definition is no longer crude as it was before. So it is not a thing. It is also not necessarily a relation between the things. It is actually, it is the generative power behind those particular kind of the attributes, the characteristics, the ways of working, the mechanisms, as we like to call them in critical realism, and so on and so forth. I hope you see. I hope I explain. So yeah, but I tried to. Why I tried to start with those definitions, because those definitions in the past created crude positions. I mean, if you go take the structure agency debate, 200 years ago, those crude positions were also there. You had positions that paid no attention to agency at all. The opposite is also true. Today, can you meet someone who will tell you structure alone or just a bit of agency, or the other way around? No. What's the puzzle today? The puzzle is the kind of way give interaction between them. And we still have a lot of differences. But these are healthy differences. But those healthy differences existed against the background in the history of thought where we had those crude positions. The transimmanent debate is no exception. But the transimmanent debate is just couched at a higher level of abstraction. That's it. I hope I answered your question. I believe I did, but yeah. Other questions? Honor, and then because.
So what's the problem with complete immanence through and through? Why not have that?
Complete immanence will not allow you to actually deal with generative explanations, because their complete immanence is a complete celebration of the specific. So it's a particular understanding of the necessary, but the necessary as specific, but not necessary as generative. The necessary as generative is not only specific, it is actually productive as well. That is the issue here. So yeah, immanent analysis is valuable. That's why I did not trash articulation. I can understand why a lot of people use it. But immanent analysis allows you, like for example, so when one of those professors that I referred to, Mark Harvey, he made a very good point. When this kind of correlation fashion became very much strong in social science and academia, he was basically made the point that, but then the economic lost its value. So, but how did they try to resuscitate that? Through the language of necessity as specificness, which I don't have a problem with. But specificness, owner, is not generative. It does not explain to me why categorically it had to exist. And I also don't think it's strong on the dispositional side. And now is my final answer. It doesn't also combine categorical and dispositional thinking together to provide for an explanation of that. I think it can do a good justice for some kind of dispositional explanation. I don't think it is quite convincing, at least for me, from a categorical point of view. But what I really would like to arrive to is kind of combination between categorical and dispositional, and there I would definitely argue it would not allow you to arrive to that stage.
Okay. To me, it seems you can achieve everything that immanence plus transcendence would achieve with immanence plus stratification. Because you would be able to make the relevant sorts of differentiations between different levels and their movements and their relations of priority to each other.
And how would you then account with emergence if it's only immanence with stratification? Then you would end up with a very, I would give you the benefit of the doubt, you would still have an account of emergence, I would give you that, but I don't think it would be high. A high level of emergence, meaning you would have a strata that is not reducible to the one that, let's say, gave it birth or where it came from, but you have no way of theorizing actually the origin, the background behind the strata where it came from. So in other words, you won't be able to actually have a very sophisticated diachronic analysis of time as well. We were talking about time. All what you would end up with this kind of version is a movement in different synchronic time. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that actually, along with Maggie, look at the debate that Maggie had with Dave Eldervas on that. I would say a high level of realism, she called it a higher acumen of realism, if I'm precise, necessitates a diachronic with the synchronic. But the way that, and I don't have a problem with the synchronic, don't get me wrong, but I think the diachronic, the importance of the diachrony of time is super important here. Okay. Then
The very important point, I think, which is which touch with your presentation is something what I call new dialectics, new dialectic, but not Hegelian or Marxist, but rather touches to the ancient Greeks dialectics in a deeper sense than at Hegel or Marx. The first step to going out to over the linear causality was, as you said, Maggie's analytical, yeah, and it is not the. I believe it is not the last step, because there are many factors and many relations between, and there are some very complicated with many levels structure of this causality. So we need to go beside, not beside, but I have problem with the word beyond. Oh, thank you. Beyond the analytical, it is a good trampoline. This idea, I think so.
Yeah, I also having an eye for the time, but very quickly before I give you the floor. Yeah, it will be very opportune to develop dialectics, but I believe this is gonna happen anyway. But why I want to highlight here the anyway, because like for example, we always, when we talk about dialectics, we always start with Hegel. By the way, I don't agree with Hegel, but I find him the master on it very strongly. However, Hegel did not invent dialectics, so it comes from a very rich background, which I'm not gonna elaborate on. So it's a raison de plus why we need to move deeper into that and articulate also and calibrate perhaps new relations as well in relation to it. Yeah, yes, but we're building this up as well. Okay.
Yes.
And I apologize. This has to be the last one because they told me.
Okay,
that,
it's quick,
yeah.
very quick. Regarding abstraction and theorizing in CR, in critical realism. Theorizing, as we know, in CR means abstraction, which means detecting the necessary conditions. Necessary conditions are concrete or abstract?
Both. Because there are two levels of analysis that are important for critical realism. The contingently necessary and the necessarily contingent. Otherwise, you won't be able to deal with the full scale of stratification with emergence at the same time. So when we are only, casually, we very much all the time talk about the contingently necessary in that sense.
Is this what Mackey called Einos condition? Do you mean this? Einos condition.
No, it's more than the inus condition, of course. Yeah, no. I'm actually, you have the inus condition. You can have also the Sween. Yeah, no, that actually goes beyond both of them. I wrote also on that, by the way. Perseverance, that the one I'm talking about, goes beyond inus and Sween in that sense. But the foundation, not the whole thing, but the foundation is we need to take into account this complex interplay between necessity and contingency to be able to deal with the abstract and the concrete. Normally, we are only talking about one, but actually we need the other one in a how should I say, in a constant dialogue.
I will read your article. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. On that note, thank you very much for your questions, and I think this concludes this part of the day. And I hope we'll see you all in the dinner. Right? All right.